2:53 a.m., Gulf of Oman, 58 nautical miles east of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran just launched a ballistic missile on a trajectory crossing the primary U.S. Navy destroyer route. The USS Gravely's Aegis combat system acquired the launch signature 8 seconds after ignition. The commanding officer had 51 seconds to determine whether the trajectory was going to put that warhead on a collision course with his ship or into the water ahead of it. American Naval Command activated an immediate response that would span 3 bodies of water and involve assets from 5 separate commands. Welcome to Navy Strikeforce. Today, we're going inside the 178 minutes that followed that launch detection. 178 minutes in which an Iranian ballistic missile crossing the U.S. Navy's most critical transit corridor triggered a cascading response that reached from a destroyer's bridge in the Gulf of Oman all the way to the National Military Command Center in Washington and produced operational changes across the entire 5th Fleet area of operations before dawn. This is what American Naval Command actually looks like when it responds immediately to a missile launch. Not the public version, the real sequence, the decisions, the timelines, the failures, and the things that worked the way they were supposed to, and the things that almost didn't. To understand why the Gravely's situation at 2:53 a.m. was more dangerous than the final summary report suggested, you need to understand the specific characteristics of the transit route the missile had crossed. The primary U.S. Navy destroyer route through the Gulf of Oman's western approaches is not a straight line, and it is not a wide corridor. It is a navigational track defined by water depth, the traffic separation scheme that coordinates commercial shipping in the area, and the operational requirement to maintain specific distances from Iranian territorial waters while still being able to respond rapidly to 5th Fleet tasking in the Strait of Hormuz. At the point where the missile's trajectory crossed the route, 58 nautical miles east of the strait, the track narrows because the 100-meter depth contour curves northward, forcing vessels on the standard route to follow a line that brings them to within 34 nautical miles of the Iranian coast. 34 nautical miles, well within the engagement envelope of every anti-ship missile system in Iran's coastal defense inventory. The Gravely had been assigned to this patrol sector for 11 hours when the launch occurred. The ship had transited the narrowing point twice during that period on the standard patrol pattern, a pattern that, as subsequent analysis would confirm, had been observable from Iranian coastal surveillance assets for the entire 11 hours. The missile's trajectory told a story that the Gravely's commanding officer recognized immediately. The launch point was a coastal site northwest of Jask, a location that Iranian forces had used for live fire exercises on multiple prior occasions, each time with prior notification to maritime traffic through NOTAM procedures. There had been no NOTAM for this launch, no prior notification, no warning on the Iranian Military Activity Coordination Network. The launch had come out of a background of routine coastal activity, with no distinguishing indicators that elevated it above the persistent low-level noise that characterizes Iranian military operations in the region every day. The absence of warning was itself a warning. It meant either that the launch was genuinely hostile, or that it was a deliberate test of American detection and response capability, conducted under conditions designed to be indistinguishable from a combat launch. Both possibilities required the same immediate response. The Gravely's commanding officer had the initial track assessment at 2:53 a.m. and 8 seconds. The Aegis combat system was generating a trajectory projection, calculating the missile's apogee, its downrange distance, and most critically, its projected impact point. The projection was updating every 2 seconds as new tracking data refined the solution. The first projection, generated at 2:53 a.m. and 14 seconds, showed an impact point 6.2 nautical miles ahead of the Gravely's current position on the patrol track. At the Gravely's current speed of 12 knots, the ship would reach that impact point in approximately 31 minutes. Not current position, future position. The missile was not aimed at where the Gravely was. It was aimed at where the Gravely would be. That is not a test firing into open water. That is a targeting solution. The second projection, updated at 2:53 a.m. and 18 seconds, refined the impact point to 5.9 nautical miles ahead. The small change reflected additional tracking data, tightening the trajectory estimate. The direction of the refinement, closer, not farther, was not reassuring. The commanding officer made the maneuver call at 2:53 a.m. and 22 seconds. Hard left turn, maximum speed. Course change of 35 degrees south. Off the patrol track, into deeper water, out of the projected impact corridor. The Gravely was turning before the 51-second classification window had even closed. At 2:54 a.m., the flash report was transmitted to 5th Fleet. Content: ballistic launch, single weapon, trajectory crossing patrol route, projected impact 5.9 nautical miles ahead of current position on track. Maneuver initiated, Aegis in full intercept-ready posture. 5th Fleet had the report at 2:55 a.m. The duty admiral was on the operations floor at 2:56 a.m. The missile impacted at 2:58 a.m., 5 minutes and 2 seconds after launch. Impact point: 5.6 nautical miles from the Gravely's original patrol track position, in the area where the ship would have been if she had continued on her standard patrol pattern at standard speed. 5.6 nautical miles from a ship that was no longer there. The Gravely's course change had moved her 1.8 nautical miles off the original track in the time between launch and impact. The impact point was 5.6 nautical miles ahead of where she had been at launch. If she had not maneuvered, if the commanding officer had waited for the 51-second classification window to close before acting, the ship would have been 3.8 nautical miles from the impact point at the moment of detonation. 3.8 nautical miles from a ballistic warhead impact is outside the lethal radius of any warhead currently in Iran's assessed inventory, but well within the zone where fragmentation, water shock, and radar/sensor disruption effects are operationally significant. The maneuver had not been necessary for survival, but the commanding officer had not known that at 2:53 a.m. and 22 seconds. He had known only that the trajectory was aimed at his ship's future position, and that waiting to confirm it was not aimed at his ship's future position was a calculation that favored the person who had already launched the missile. He had maneuvered. It was the right call. Now the response machine began to move. American Naval Command, 5th Fleet, CENTCOM, and the National Military Command Center operating in parallel had been active on the Gravely incident since 2:55 a.m. By 3:01 a.m., 3 separate response work streams were running simultaneously. The first work stream was tactical: defensive repositioning of all U.S. surface combatants in the Gulf of Oman and Persian Gulf, whose patrol patterns placed them on routes geometrically similar to the one the missile had crossed. The analysis required for this task, identifying which patrol patterns were geometrically predictable enough to be targetable in the same way the Gravely's had been, took 22 minutes and involved 5th Fleet's operations staff working against the clock to generate modified patrol tracks before Iranian planners could exploit the same methodology against additional vessels. The analysis identified 4 other patrol patterns in the current operational roster that showed sufficient predictability to be vulnerable to a targeting solution generated from sustained coastal observation. All 4 vessels received modified patrol instructions by 3:23 a.m., 30 minutes after the initial launch. The second work stream was intelligence, determining as rapidly as possible whether the launch had been an isolated provocation or the opening action of a coordinated attack sequence. This required integrating data from multiple sources, signals intelligence on Iranian military communications in the period surrounding the launch, satellite imagery of known Iranian missile storage and launcher sites, analysis of Iranian naval and air force activity in the region, into an assessment that could support operational decision-making. The initial intelligence assessment, completed at 3:11 a.m., characterized the launch as high-confidence single-weapon isolated provocation rather than coordinated attack opening. The confidence was based primarily on the absence of indicators associated with coordinated operations. No surge in Iranian military communications, no movement of additional launcher vehicles toward firing positions, no increased activity at Iranian air bases or naval facilities. The assessment was flagged as preliminary. Intelligence assessments made 18 minutes after a missile launch, in the middle of the night, with incomplete data, carry inherent uncertainty that the word high confidence cannot fully convey. The third workstream was strike positioning. This was the most consequential and the most politically sensitive element of the response. A ballistic missile launch against a U.S. Navy destroyer's projected patrol track, regardless of whether it was framed as a test, a provocation, or an outright attack, created a legal and operational basis for a proportional military response under U.S. rules of engagement and international law. The strike positioning workstream was developing options, not orders. But developing options required moving assets, and moving assets was visible at 3:07 a.m. 2FA 18F. Super Hornets from Carrier Air Wing 1 embarked aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford operating in the northern Arabian Sea, were repositioned from their standard combat air patrol orbit to a holding position 90 nautical miles south of the assessed launch site. The repositioning was not a strike order. It was an options generation movement, placing assets in a position where, if an order came, they could execute within minutes, rather than the 25 to 30 minutes required from the standard KP orbit. At 3:09 a.m., an EA-18G Growler was launched from the Ford and directed to the coastal area north of the launch site. The Growler's mission, electronic reconnaissance, characterizing the emissions environment at and around the launch site in the period following the launch, looking for indicators of preparation for a second launch. The Growler reached its operating position at 3:31 a.m. and immediately began collecting. What it found was unexpected. The launch site area was electronically quiet. Not the quiet of a site that had finished its operation and shut down. A site in post-launch shutdown shows specific emission patterns as equipment powers down in a recognizable sequence. The silence was the kind associated with a site that had been in emission control mode from the beginning. A site that had conducted its launch operation with minimal electronic emissions, reducing the observable signature that intelligence systems could collect. Emission control launch procedures are not standard for Iranian test firings. They are standard for Iranian operational launch procedures. The procedures used when a launch is being conducted in a way designed to minimize the intelligence the adversary can collect about the launch operation. The Growler's finding changed the intelligence assessment. At 3:44 a.m., the intelligence community revised the launch characterization from high-confidence isolated provocation to ambiguous, either an isolated provocation conducted with operational emission discipline or a test of Iranian operational launch procedures under realistic conditions. The distinction between those two characterizations matters enormously for response planning. An isolated provocation calls for a measured diplomatic and military response that raises the cost to Iran without providing escalatory pretext. A test of operational launch procedures suggests Iran is preparing its missile forces for a genuine operational employment. And the response to that possibility involves a different level of military urgency. The revised assessment reached the NMCC at 3:46 a.m. Consider the decision the duty admiral at 5th Fleet was facing at 3:48 a.m. He had two Super Hornets in a holding orbit 90 nautical miles from the launch site. He had a Growler characterizing an emission environment that was consistent with operational rather than test launch procedures. He had a revised intelligence assessment that had moved from isolated provocation to ambiguous in 37 minutes. And he had the authority, under the rules of engagement in effect, to order a strike against the launch site infrastructure if he assessed that the launch had constituted a hostile act and that further hostile acts were threatened. Three options were genuinely on the table at 3:48 a.m. Option A authorized the Super Hornets to conduct a precision strike against the launcher vehicle and associated support infrastructure at the launch site. Destroy the capability that had launched against the Gravely. Accept the strategic consequences of the first direct U.S. strike on Iranian soil in years. Option B. Direct the Super Hornets to conduct a show of presence pass along the Iranian coastline adjacent to the launch site. Visible, deliberate, unhurried, communicating capability, and intent without crossing into kinetic engagement. Option C. Hold all assets in current positions. Continue Growler collection and request National Command Authority guidance before taking any action that could constitute the opening of a direct military engagement with Iran. What would you order? Comment A, B, or C below. Because the decision had already been made at a level above 5th Fleet. At 3:52 a.m., guidance arrived from the NMCC. No strike authorized at this time. Show of presence authorized. Growler collection to continue. Full intelligence assessment to be completed before any further escalatory action. The Super Hornets executed the show of presence pass at 4:01 a.m. A low-altitude transit along the Iranian coastline within visible range of the launch site area, 35 nautical miles offshore, conducted at 400 knots with navigation lights off. No Iranian air defense response. The Growler completed its collection orbit and returned to the ford at 4:44 a.m. The USS gravely resumed her patrol at 4:17 a.m. on a modified track that had been designed to eliminate the geometric predictability that the pre-dawn launch had exploited. By 5:11 a.m., all 4 vessels with vulnerable patrol patterns had transitioned to their modified tracks. 5th Fleet's immediate tactical response to the launch had been completed. The post-incident assessment was thorough, and its primary finding was one that had appeared in previous assessments and would appear in future ones. The launch had been made possible by a patrol pattern predictable enough to generate a targeting solution from coastal observation alone. The Gravely had been on the same general track at similar times for 11 hours. 11 hours of observation from a coastal radar site. Not a sophisticated collection asset, just a radar, had been sufficient to project the ship's future position with enough accuracy to calibrate a ballistic missile trajectory. The modified patrol track order that went to 4 ships at 3:23 a.m. addressed the immediate vulnerability. The standing guidance update that followed, requiring systematic randomization of patrol patterns across all 5th Fleet surface combatants, with specific procedures for track variation that could not be anticipated from prior observation, addressed the structural vulnerability that had produced the targeting solution. But the assessment also noted something that the operational changes could not address. The emission control launch procedure the Growler had documented was not a one-time event. It was evidence of a practiced capability. Iranian missile forces had conducted at least this one launch with the emission discipline associated with genuine operational procedures. That practice takes repetition to develop. The launch against the Gravely's patrol track was not the first time Iran had practiced emission control procedures for ballistic missile operations. It was simply the first time those procedures had been documented by a U.S. collection asset in a post-launch reconnaissance mission. How many times had Iran launched with emission control procedures before this incident? How many times had those launches been observed and correctly characterized as emission controlled rather than standard test firings? The assessment did not have an answer to that question. And not having an answer to it was, in the most precise sense, the most dangerous thing about the whole incident. The Gravely had maneuvered at 2:53 a.m. and 22 seconds. A commanding officer's instinct had moved a ship 1.8 nautical miles off a patrol track in the seconds before full trajectory data was available. That instinct had been the margin. Next time, the margin might not depend on instinct. Stay sharp, stay informed. This is Navy Strikeforce. We'll see you in the next one.